You get a lot of stories working in this industry.
The day that you think that you've seen it all, you might as well check out, because I promise you the next day you're going to see something that you've never seen before.
Welcome back to NEMT Experts. I've got again with me Ray Hagan, who was one of our first podcast guests. He is the president of JARPEC and the vice president of WellTrans, which is the largest NEMT broker in the state of Indiana. Ray, how you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks everybody for having me on.
Ray, you have a rich background in NEMT. You've been working in the industry for quite a while at one of the leading and best brokers in the country. Can you just give us a bit of background about yourself, how you got into NEMT and your journey in the industry?
Yeah, so kind of a little bit about me. I actually had no intention of getting into NEMT as a service. I kind of knew about it, but I actually started off in the fire service. So I started off as a firefighter. Went to school, became a paramedic, did that for a good chunk of time, and then decided to transition off into a more regular work schedule to be with my family. So I'm fortunate enough to have a wonderful wife and 4 beautiful kids, and wanted to be there for special events with them. So kind of in my transition out of the fire and emergency responder field, NEMT was a really natural fit for me, because I had worked as a critical care transport paramedic for kind of the last couple of years in my cycle in emergency response, doing a lot of transfers, things like that, and found that there were a lot of individuals who could have prevented a lot of health insecurities and prevented a lot of hospital stays and things like that if they would have had access to transportation to go to a regular primary care or go to specialists, things like that. So that's when I transitioned out of the emergency response field and got into working with another broker in the provider relations field. Did that for a little while and then transitioned over to, at the time, what was a company that just had an idea. Based here out of Indianapolis, we had, inner workings with several different MCOs here in the state of Indiana, and one of the biggest issues that they ran into was how the NEMT brokerage system worked here in the state of Indiana. It's a primarily rural state outside of roughly 6 large cities, and a large national brokerage really didn't encompass that rural aspect of Indiana, and they struggled. So that's where we kind of built and developed WellTrans as an idea, and we pitched that to several of the large MCOs here in the state, and then ultimately became a reality. So in December of 2020, we took our first trip, and we have been running strong ever since. So here in the state, we operate both Medicaid and Medicare, and we are bringing on additional plans consistently here, both in Indiana, with conversations about outside rural states who have similar geographies to that of Indiana, where there's some large metropolitan areas, but primarily a rural population.
Interesting, Ray. This is a great story of, there are bigger NEMT brokers that have been around for much longer than WellTrans, right? You've been around since the beginning. You've been with WellTrans for, nearly this full 6 years that WellTrans has existed. And in that time, you guys have become the largest broker in the entire state of Indiana. I want to get into, what is it that you were able to do that, you know, these other brokers who existed in the state beforehand or maybe still exist, you know, what is it that separated you? You know, like you mentioned, Indiana is largely rural, right? And you were able to work with that, and be a broker that caters to the rural aspect. Like, what is it actually, the nuts and bolts of what you were able to do that made you the broker of choice for dealing in these rural areas?
Yeah, so I think there's several different aspects to what separates WellTrans from other brokers. One is that WellTrans is Indiana based. So all of our employees are and live within the state of Indiana. We don't operate out of state or out of country call centers. So when somebody calls in, is calling in for a trip from, say, Fort Wayne to Indianapolis, on a map, it's one large highway that connects the two. However, that one large highway may be the difference between an hour and a half or a 3-hour trip based on weather conditions, things like that. The other thing too that I want to make sure is kind of our biggest aspect is we take a zero fail approach. At no point do we ever not want to transport a member to their appointment, because you know a lot of these members are, you know, their sons, daughters, husbands, wives, grandparents, to our employees, things like that. You know, everybody is somebody, so to say, and we don't want to take an aspect of them being a number. So we're going to do everything that we can to strategically place transportation providers throughout the entire state to make sure that that member receives the same level of care as somebody who, say, lives in Indianapolis, a large metropolitan city, numerous transportation providers. Well, somebody who lives in, say, Orange County, which roughly has a population of 10 to 12,000 people, they don't have access to the same level of transportation services as people in Indianapolis. So we make sure that we plan for that and have providers strategically placed to be able to accommodate those trips. Then the last piece of it too is that we look at our transportation providers as partners. Essentially, we take a bar stool approach. You know, it's a 3-leg stool. On one side, you have your MCO partner or client. On another side, you have us as the broker. And then on the third leg, you have your transportation providers. Without one of those pieces clearly communicating and being engaged and active, the whole thing falls apart. Transportation providers and your MCOs, they're not expending. You shouldn't treat them as such. You should actively work to build and grow those individuals and those entities to be able to perform at their highest level. And when you see deficiencies, you know, being able to work with them to fine tune, you know, because you might have a transportation provider who does really, really well in one certain area. But if you don't dig into what that is, you never figure it out and you lose the potential of a great partnership with that transportation provider who could service a massive part of the population.
Can you give me an example of that?
Yeah, so a great example is we, in Indiana, we have an abundance of Indianapolis-based providers. Okay, now those providers can absolutely fulfill every aspect of that trip and the trip requests that we have in the greater Indianapolis metropolitan area. However, about 45 minutes south in a city called Bloomington, which hosts the IU, Indiana University college campus, which anybody who's a basketball fan or football fan might have heard of them this year. But it's a, outside of the college campus itself, it's a very rural part of the state. And you have a lot of individuals who are traveling 30, 45 minutes outside of that area into Bloomington or up to Indianapolis to receive care. So what we do is we strategically work with transportation providers who may have been, originally based in that Indianapolis area to say, hey, we actually have a greater need in the Bloomington area and these, couple of counties. Can you relocate some of your drivers to this area? And we work with them to, fill out their schedule, complete those trips, openly communicate with them on, pros and cons to that area. Rather than other situations of, hey, I just need you to go do a thing. It's here's everything about this area that I need you to know to be successful. And when you take that approach of, hey, here's 50 or 60 legs of transportation in this specific area. We've mapped it out. We've built a schedule. It takes roughly 6, 7, 8 vehicles based on time, distance, geography, all those different things. Here's what we think we can do to accomplish this group of trips. We also kick back to that provider to go, hey, do you think this is reasonable? Instead of just saying, hey, you have to make this work. It's, can you accomplish this? Because if they go, I can't, that's okay. What part of this can you accomplish? And then we subsidize the additional pieces, maybe with other providers, local councils on aging, local transit authorities, things like that, to engulf that population to make sure that all of their transportation requests are covered. Trying to keep things as local as possible for the transportation providers that are local, but then filling that gap with other providers to make sure that our members are taken care of.
So Ray, this makes a lot of sense. Like the zero fail approach, making sure that every person can be transferred, like doing everything it takes to treat transportation providers as your partners rather than just, hey, go do these trips, make it work, right? Like it takes a lot of work and effort on WellTrans's part to actually do all the nuts and bolts of actually operating that way, right? Like obviously it's easier to just, hey, here are trips, go do them. You can't do them, let's find some other transport provider, right? But that's maybe not sustainable, which is why you don't do that. That's why you guys, have a reputation for being, a good broker that transportation providers like working with. What is the hardest part of actually operating in the way WellTrans does?
I think the biggest hurdle that we come across is just the constant reminder for communication, because we understand that transportation providers they have their own business. These are people's livelihoods, and that we have to treat them as such. But reminding them that being communicative with us. Hey, we had a driver go down. Hey, we want to expand. Hey, we need to shrink. Hey, we're, whatever the situation is, reminding all of our partners to just openly communicate that with us. Because I think that other entities have a very iron fist approach. And it's very reminiscent of the, being in elementary school, you get your hand smacked a couple of times, you stop asking questions. You sit down, you do your homework, and that's what it is. And we don't take that approach, and it's the biggest barrier is reminding our partners that it's okay to communicate, success and failure. Openly communicate that with us, because the more that we know, the better prepared we can be for situations. Hey, you have a driver go down? Okay, it happens. People get sick. Everybody's human. Hey, you misjudged this schedule. Okay, communicate that with us, because at the end of the day, we want to make sure that none of our members are left without transportation. And it's far easier to do when we know about the situation and we know what's going on than it is to find out about it, an hour later when the member calls and goes, hey, nobody showed up. Right? That's the part where it's that pill to swallow.
Yeah. And Ray, I want the audience to know the scale of how you guys operate? Because, you know, some people might think, oh yeah, it's easy to do this and have this high level of communication when you're dealing with a small number of transportation providers. But can you just give us the number? How many transportation providers does WellTrans work with?
Yeah, so in the state of Indiana, we operate in all 92 counties throughout the entire state. So everything from Gary to Evansville, over to Fort Wayne, down to Jeffersonville. We have 169, 170 providers here in our local network, and over 1,400 vehicles that are registered and credentialed. So we have a lot of moving pieces. Last year, WellTrans, just for things that we covered, completed over 800,000 legs of transportation throughout the entire state. Again, we have a decent chunk of larger metropolitan areas, but a majority of our trip volume came from rural parts of the state. It's roughly a 70-30 split for rural versus urban requests.
Okay. Pretty massive.
Yes.
Can you tell me, over the years, what sort of practices, technologies, systems have you implemented to help you manage as you scale that big?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple aspects to this. One, internally, from a brokerage standpoint, being able to incorporate software that helps with auto routing, right? So having a software that you set up to be able to automatically send trips out to providers in certain locations. Okay, that is a massive piece of it. The other thing, though, that I think is equally, if not more important, is for transportation providers to invest in software of their own. Because Indiana is a unique situation in that you have roughly 7 different MCOs here in the state of Indiana that cover all 92 counties. So they essentially layer on top of each other. So out of the 4 brokers here in Indiana, all 4 of us cover all 92 counties, which makes it very, very difficult when you're trying to plan, schedule, accommodate providers, because you only know what you're giving to them. You don't know what the other brokers are giving to them. You don't know, who's doing what, where they're doing it, what times. So you're sending out your trips and hoping that they take your stuff. So if a transportation provider is looking to really become efficient, really looking to do a good job, investing in a software that can help take in those trips from all the brokers to say, here's the best schedule that we can build to be efficient and make the most out of our vehicles during a given time frame, is something that I recommend to every transportation provider, regardless of how big or how small they are. In Indiana, we have everything from, mom and pops providers that are, 1 or 2 vehicles, to transportation providers that have 40 to 60 vehicles. Obviously there's a big difference in the time and staffing demand for both. But when you have a software who can say, hey, I can hit a button and it's going to take all of the trips that I have sent over to me, build a schedule, regardless if it's 2 or 60, and can build that schedule out, you're saving hundreds and hundreds of man hours trying to make the most out of your schedule, but also doing it quickly. Because when a transportation provider can't do a trip, the sooner they tell that broker, the better the chance of getting that trip rerouted is.
Are you able to share what tech systems WellTrans and WellTrans partners use?
Yeah, so I mean, one of our more favorite ones would be Bambi, because it is actually the only natively integrated dispatching software into what our own internal system is. The nice part about that is it allows us and our transportation providers to seamlessly communicate trips. So we can send them trips. They can accept or decline them. If we have an update, say a member calls in the day of and says, hey, the weather's bad, or I'm not feeling well, I don't need to go. As soon as we hit cancel in our system, that immediately alerts the provider, hey, this trip has been canceled. You don't need to run this trip anymore. So being able to seamlessly communicate that quickly saves a lot of time and resource, not having to travel, wherever they're going, on trips that aren't needed anymore. The other thing too is that I really, really like about the Bambi system, with the integration with our own internal systems, is that from a billing standpoint, it is seamless. It allows for electronic claim submission or trip completion details submission. WellTrans requires that signatures are obtained for all trips. That data flows directly into us. We have that. We can see that as soon as the trip is completed, those details immediately pop into our system, and we can go, oh, this trip is completed. Now we can see all the details. So when the member was picked up, when they were dropped off, what the transport time was, what the miles were, what the trip cost for that's going to be. Hey, we have the signature. Boom. That's all done instantaneously. And now we can seamlessly process that over into our claims and reimbursement team to quicken the pace of when our transportation providers are reimbursed for successful trip completion details. Rather than saying, hey, I need you to fill out this paper log, and I need you to submit that back to us. And then we have to verify with each trip, hey, there's a signature for this trip. There's, here are the completion details. It's all been entered. Okay, boom, now we can submit it over. We're cutting, anywhere from 1 to 2 weeks off of that process to be able to get providers reimbursed for trips that they're completing. And it has the geocoding for these trips to say, hey, there was a driver who showed up at this member's residence. And it's no longer, it decreases a lot of the fraud, waste, and abuse that tends to run rampant in the NEMT environment.
So Ray, as you know, you've been working with us. Bambi just completed its native integration with WellTrans' internal system just last month. You manage WellTrans' internal fleet and have been using Bambi for the past few months now. Would you care to just pop it open and share how it looks and how it is to use?
Yeah, so I'm actually going to show a couple of things here. All right, so this is just a condensed version of our internal fleet standpoint. But the beautiful thing about this is, from an internal fleet standpoint, we utilize our vehicles in what we classify as emergency recovery. So this is a scenario of, a traditional transportation provider had a car breakdown, or this is an escalated member who doesn't ride well with other transportation providers. Or this is something that's urgent, popped up, and another transportation provider couldn't reach them in the allotted time. So that's where the internal fleet standpoint of this comes in. But so like just pulling up, a handful of vehicles here. So I've got our units 3 through 6 showing here. But the nice part about it is you can see color coded the different statuses. So, for this member here being green, hey, I click on it. Okay, this driver's transporting this member. Okay, so I know that they're in great shape. Okay, they met their time frame. Okay, oh, here we go. Here's another one. This driver right here is transporting. Oh, this one's in blue, but the trip doesn't, the pickup isn't until 2:20. Okay, well, it still shows assigned. Things that are in gray are completed. If there's an issue with the trip, or if they're running behind or they're delayed, it'll pop up in yellow, and it immediately notifies the dispatch team, hey, there's something going on with this trip. The nice part about that is that lets a transportation provider know, hey, if my driver went en route, and is going to be delayed, it's going to show up yellow, which means that I can call that member and I can say, hey, I know your pickup was, say, at 1:30. When you click on it, it'll tell you what the estimated time of arrival is, and you can let that member know ahead of time. Hey, I realize that your scheduled pickup was for 1:30. However, due to weather conditions up in your area, we're running a little bit behind. Your estimated time for pickup is 1:45 or 1:40. Be able to clearly identify and communicate that with a member, one, helps their reassurance in knowing that somebody is still coming to get them, who they are needing to look out for, and then limit some of that call back aspect that comes into the call center, right? Because if, in Indiana, if somebody's running 10 minutes late, a member's going to call back in and say, hey, where's my transportation provider? If somebody doesn't have or isn't integrated with this software for us to be able to know, oh, hey, their provider's on the way, then we have to call that transportation provider. Hey, how far is your drive? Depending on what they have, it may take them a couple of minutes to figure out, well, based on GPS, they're, 10, 20, 30 minutes out. Or they have to call the driver, hey, where are you at? They have to pull it up on Google Maps, things like that. And it's just a inefficient use of time and resources. So being able to see that in real time, what's going on. But also too, being able to just kind of keep tabs on the drivers. Hey, it's coming up on your pickup. I see you haven't gone en route yet. Is everything okay? Oh, well, we had a tire blowout. Or hey, I'm stopping for gas. I'm going right after that. So being able to clearly see what's going on with your fleet is of huge importance for time and efficiency standpoint. But then also just being able to go out and schedule your trips. So I'm going to go a couple of days out here to be able to see, it's, using the same 4 units, 3 through 6 here. You can assign them individually if you want to assign them individually. It's as easy as clicking on it and accepting. Now, once that trip's accepted within the Bambi system, it immediately alerts our internal system, hey, this trip is accepted, and we're good to go. But at the same time, we can also click on all of them and hit this beautiful button down here that says Run Bambi Run, and then select all the drivers that we want it to go through, and it's going to plan their entire schedule out based on the trip volume that we have. So what it's doing based on the garage location for that vehicle and the hours of service that driver would typically drive, it's going to build their schedule based on who's closer, what's more efficient, what makes more sense from a time and resource efficiency standpoint. So you're not burning excess miles, having drivers go out of their way to go pick people up. You're getting a closer driver. You're able to make the most of your schedule that you really can't do from a human to human standpoint. There's a lot of great individuals out there who can plan spectacular routes, but it takes time. It takes a lot of time. It took me 5 seconds. So
Bambi Run.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. And then once you figure out what you do or don't want to do, you can hit apply or you can hit cancel, and you can rerun it. And all of those things really make a big difference in daily operational efficiencies for organizations. If you're a mom and pop's organization that has just a handful of vehicles where the owner's also driving, there's nothing more tiring than being in a situation where you wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning, you're on the road by 4 a.m., you're running a full 10-hour day transporting people, you come back, then you have to plan your route for the next day, then you have to submit billing, and it takes up a lot of time. This cuts all that down to minutes instead of hours.
Love it. Ray, can you tell me about what's next for WellTrans? You guys are winning more contracts. You guys are growing as always. What's contributing to WellTrans's continued scalability and growth? And how is WellTrans going about just becoming bigger and better and helping more people get transport?
Yeah, so I think that most organizations' answer is world domination, right? We don't have any. We don't want to do that. We have found what we do really, really well, and that's what we want to do. We provide a spectacular service to rural communities and rural organizations and rural states, and that's what we do really, really well at, and that's where we like to be. WellTrans can't go and be competitive in a New York or Connecticut type environment. And honestly, we don't have any reason to go out there. But, places like Iowa, Montana, Midwest, where most of the state is rural, those are our places that we feel we can do a spectacular job and really change the status quo for what is NEMT and the service level that's being offered to those members and recipients of Medicare or Medicaid plans, to be able to get them a different level of health. We want to make sure that transportation is not a barrier to anybody being able to live a long, healthy life.
This is, of course, going to be an oversimplification, Ray, but if I could just take away one thing that WellTrans does exceptionally well that allows you to be such a great broker, you guys just communicate a lot. Like, it takes a lot to communicate a lot, and you guys actually put in that effort to just communicate a whole ton with your transportation providers, with your MCOs, with your passengers. You just communicate with everyone. Communication.
Yeah, and that's what we have found to be our biggest advantage, is when you communicate with everybody about what's going on, nobody's left surprised. Again, NEMT is not a perfect environment, and anybody who says that they can provide a perfect situation to NEMT is blatantly lying. But what I can say is that the people who communicate and set expectations and really go out and try, not for their sake, not for the provider's sake, but for the sake of the members, to get them taken care of. And they communicate what is going well or what isn't. Those are the organizations that succeed, because they have the buy-in from the member, their clients, states, the providers, because everybody wants to just know what's going on.
Can you tell us any interesting, fun story?
So my best story, and one that I am significantly proud of, is that about 2 years ago, we had an individual who was on an MCO sponsored plan, who was in the process of receiving a liver transplant. It was not an ideal situation. They lived out in a very rural part of the state, and they had gotten word that they could potentially be receiving a donor organ for their replacement. Obviously, that is a very critical situation. They had to go in for some testing, things like that. We were able to get that accomplished. However, the time frame of when this all happened also happened to go over the calendar month. The member happened to transition from our client MCO to another MCO during this transition. They had received word on like the 4th or 5th of that month after they transitioned that their organ was on the way, and they had roughly 6 hours to get to a hospital about 180 miles away. We worked tirelessly to get that member taken care of. And it ultimately resulted in me and our CEO hopping in a vehicle and driving 2 hours to go pick this person up, and then taking them all the way to their organ transplant. Even though they were not a member of ours, we felt the moral obligation to get this person taken care of, because they had waited a significant amount of time for this transplant. And it was, if we could do nothing else but just get them there, that was success in our book. They ended up getting the transplant. Things went well. They are living a happy and fulfilled life right now. And we frequently get updates from them and their case manager. So we were super excited about how that all turned out, and glad that we could be part of their success. That would probably be my most impactful and meaningful story here in the NEMT side.
Being human. I love it.
Yeah,
I always tell people, don't get into this industry if it's just about the money. Like, it has to be about a lot more. And that story basically says it all.
Well, and that's it. Is if you're trying to get into NEMT specifically for the money, you're already behind the 8 ball. You have to do this for the people, because if you're not doing it for them, you're not going to succeed.
Okay, you got another story for us?
I do. So this one is not as not as sentimental. It's more comical than anything. But at one point, we did have a member who decided to run us around roughly 16 different places throughout the Indianapolis area. Again, because of our dedication to the member to not leave them stranded, the member bounced between 16 different facilities over a 12-hour period here within Indianapolis, because they were ultimately looking for a hot meal. After about the 4th time, I and my provider relations manager hopped in one of the fleet vehicles, and we drove around Indianapolis, stopping at all of the homeless shelters and all of the local ERs here. Finally got the member, and whenever we pulled up and we were like, "Hey, we're here with transportation. We're here to finally take you where you're supposed to go." And his immediate response to us is, "As long as there's a Burger King, I don't care where we go." All right, bud.
You get a lot of stories working in this industry.
The day that you think that you've seen it all, you might as well check out, because I promise you the next day you're going to see something that you've never seen before.
Fun times. Ray, thank you so much for your wisdom and your interesting stories. And I'm just excited for Bambi and WellTrans to just get more transport done better and easier for everyone. I'm putting the contact info of WellTrans and Ray in the description of this video. Ray, thank you so much.
Run, Bambi, run.
Awesome. Thanks, Ray.